down the front door of your house with guns. We trust them to do a lot of things, to handle investigations of the utmost sensitivity and importance, often against powerful national figures. It is critical, obviously, that a body like the FBI ought to be transparent and accountable. Instead, the FBI apparently sees itself as a fourth branch of government under no obligation to explain itself to our country's elected officials. This is a problem. Republican Senator Ron Johnson represents Wisconsin. He chairs the Senate Homeland Security Committee. He and his committee have spent years trying to get information from the FBI, only to be, there's no other word for it, stonewalled in case after case. Today, Johnson released former FBI Director Jim Comey's draft statement on the Hillary Clinton email probe. The draft makes it crystal clear that the document was edited in a way that considerably watered down the Bureau's findings to Clinton's benefit. The question is, who made those edits? The FBI will not say. Many suspect it's Peter Strzok. Strzok, of course, has since been exposed as a fierce partisan who detested the president, loved Hillary Clinton, and thought the FBI needed, quote, insurance against a Trump win. Comey's letter is far from the only evidence of FBI heel-dragging. It has repeatedly ignored congressional requests for information related to a whole bunch of things, including the Boston bombing attack, the Tsarnaev brothers, you'll remember, the attempted shooting in Garland, Texas, that an undercover FBI agent helped provoke. The Bureau has even now imposed a non-disclosure agreement on another government watchdog in an effort to keep it from sharing its findings with Congress. Is that even allowed? Senator Johnson has sent 2 letters to the FBI demanding they explain their behavior. He joins us in the studio now. Senator, thanks for joining us.
Hello, Tucker.
So the question is, your office released today the draft of this Comey speech, and it's pretty clear that someone changed it in Hillary's favor.
Right.
And I think any reasonable person can conclude that. The question is who. You've asked the FBI to explain who made these edits. Why won't they respond?
They don't believe they need to, or they have to. They're not going to be compelled to, apparently. What's really interesting about this is this draft statement was done months before they completed the interviews. The FBI, again, this investigation into Clinton's email really was not meant to uncover the truth leading to a prosecution. From my standpoint, it was really meant to cover up the truth and exonerate Hillary Clinton. And the fact that you have the FBI director writing basically a letter, a statement exonerating Hillary Clinton, but in that letter, in the earlier draft, he was using the term gross negligence a number of times. He was talking about the sheer volume of the material that would be classified, which would be one of the standards in terms of why he would prosecute. Later on, he talks about, well, it's just not the volume there. But he earlier had in there that just the sheer volume would indicate this. So there's so many things in the initial statement that would lead to people saying, well, why didn't you indict? And I remember when he held that news conference.
Yes, that was in July.
I had attorneys that were prosecutors, and as he was going through the evidence, people were going, man, he's going to indict her. He's going to indict her. And then, whoa, he's not indicting her.
But it doesn't make any sense. I mean, so the letter you sent today lays out the timeline, and it's really interesting. So the draft was written or edited at the beginning of May 2016. Comey didn't read it in public till 2 months later. When this was written, basically exonerating Hillary Clinton, they had not interviewed Hillary, Cheryl Mills, and about a dozen other people. So that just looks like a sham to me.
Well, and then you take a look at the immunity agreements they gave to Cheryl Mills and Heather Samuelson. They gave them. They basically blocked the FBI from looking at certain emails for certain time frames that would have proven potentially obstruction of justice. They allowed them to then destroy their computers. This is not an investigation that was serious about uncovering the truth.
So if I'm looking at this at home and I don't live in Washington, why shouldn't I conclude that the powerful get a pass? If I did this, I'd be charged with a felony. If someone powerful like Hillary Clinton does it, she gets off.
Well, that's the problem, is we have seen now with this Lois Lerner in the IRS politicizing probably the most fearsome government agency from the standpoint of most Americans, uses a political weapon. We've seen the politicization of the FBI. So we are losing confidence in these institutions that should be bedrocks of our democracy. And again, I have no idea why the FBI just doesn't come clean and provide this information to Congress. What are they trying to hide? What are they trying to cover up?
Have they explained this to you? I mean, how can you exonerate someone before interviewing that person or other key figures in the investigation? Really simple question. Have they answered that?
No, absolutely not. They're not, other than hiding behind the NDA, they're not telling us why they won't release this information.
So you're a co-equal branch of government. Unlike every person at the FBI, you were elected by voters. So a basic question of democracy hangs in the balance here. What can you do? They're required by the Constitution to answer your questions. You probably have the
we have legitimate oversight.
Of course.
That is our constitutional responsibility and duty and right. And, so we can subpoena. But again, we have no power to really enforce those subpoenas. That resides within the executive branch, within the Department of Justice, and that's where the problem lies.
So what can you do?
Well, we'll keep making these things public, and hopefully public pressure will force the FBI to come clean if they really want to remove the suspicion surrounding not only what happened back under the Hillary Clinton email investigation, but currently what's happening under the Mueller investigation.
So I'm not saying this
again, they're the same cast of characters involved in both.
Not as a partisan, not as an elected Republican, but just as an American. Do you find this a little scary?
Yes, absolutely. And more than frustrating.
I can't imagine. Senator Ron Johnson, thank you.
Have a good night.
The State Department apparently struck a deal with Hillary Clinton and her aide, Huma Abedin, that allowed them to remove files, hard copies of files and records they claimed were personal, and keep them from the public eye. This does not happen in federal agencies. Typically, Fox News chief national correspondent Ed Henry has been on it, and he has details. Hey, Ed.
Tucker, good to see you. These explosive documents out today suggest, well, Hillary Clinton certainly got a lot of scrutiny about her email server. She also had people buried deep inside the federal government, including at the State Department, who helped try to keep her out of trouble. As you noted, this is a result of a lawsuit by the conservative group Judicial Watch. And what they found is that the State Department allowed Clinton and top aides like Huma Abedin to go in and remove electronic and hard copy records from her official time as Secretary of State before she left office. The claim is that they were unclassified records and they were quote-unquote personal materials. In fairness, some of the records were deemed to be personal correspondence, but other records that were removed, we're told, were very official-sounding records like her schedules, her call logs, who she spoke to over the phone. We're told Abedin, for example, was allowed to take 5 boxes of physical materials out of the State Department headquarters here in Washington, including a set of records titled Muslim engagement documents. Also interesting is that these records included so-called gift binders. What Judicial Watch believes that to be is lists of gifts that the Clinton Foundation received from various donors around the world. That could obviously shed some light not just on the gifts that were received, but potential official actions taken by the Clinton State Department. Here's the key question tonight that we do not know, is whether or not there were copies made by the State Department of these electronic and physical records. Because even if they took them out, obviously, there could be a record buried somewhere in the State Department that will eventually come out, Tucker.
Ed Henry, thank you for that.
Thank you.
We're going to discuss what Ed just told us in just a minute with our guest. But first, we want to ask him about the changes to the Comey memo. Alan Dershowitz is, of course, a retired Harvard law professor, one of the country's great experts on the Constitution, and he joins us tonight. So, Professor, about the Comey memo, which was apparently written 2 months before he read it and 2 months before the FBI completed its interviews of key figures in the investigation, including Hillary Clinton and Cheryl Mills. How could you write a memo exonerating someone before the investigation had concluded?
Well, first let's look at the big picture. Does anybody want to live under a judicial system where one's freedom depends on whether the conduct was grossly negligent or extremely careless? Those are the vaguest possible terms. If you asked 100 potential jurors, which is worse, being grossly negligent or extremely careless, they'd probably split 50-50.
No, that's a great point.
And so these rules are absurd, the way we criminalize conduct using terms like that that endanger everyone's civil liberties. Also, let's look at the other big picture. Comey's decision to make the statement calling her extremely careless may very well have contributed to her losing the election. Comey was not her friend. Comey was perceived to be somebody who was trying to strike an appropriate balance. And what I think happened here is ultimately Comey, not anybody else, made the decision on balance that she should not be prosecuted. And that's why the words were changed, because if he had said that she was grossly negligent, people would say, oh my God, that's a crime. But he had already made the decision based on the fact that nobody had ever been prosecuted who was in a position of authority like Hillary Clinton for conduct in any way similar to this, and that was in his statement. So I do think that it was the right decision not to prosecute her criminally, and I think the change of the language was designed to simply support that decision. Now, look, no decision should ever be made until an investigation is complete.
Well, obviously, but why shouldn't we know exactly what happened?
With a predisposition.
So, but I mean, you're the constitutional scholar, but Congress has oversight, committees have oversight of the federal agencies, including the FBI, and they've asked a really simple question, which was, who made these changes? Why, they can't get an answer. So isn't that unconstitutional? How can the FBI deny them that answer?
They shouldn't be able to. Our system of checks and balances permits Congress to subpoena and learn what the FBI has done. The FBI is a creature of Congress. It's part of the executive department, to be sure. We have separation of powers. But checks and balances permits Congress to check on the executive branch. So I think transparency and constitutionality require that the FBI disclose that important piece of information.
Interesting. What do you make of the deal that the State Department struck with Hillary Clinton and her top aide, Huma Abedin, that allowed them to take files out of the building and prevented those files from being seen under FOIA, Freedom of Information Act? I've never heard of anything like that. Have you?
Well, I think routinely people who serve as Secretary of State and other positions are going to write books, and they routinely take material home that are deemed to be personal. Usually copies are maintained at the government agency, and I would bet that copies, electronic copies, exist of what Hillary Clinton removed. It's worth asking about, but I wouldn't jump to any conclusions. And again, I don't want to see criminalization become the first resort. If we don't like what somebody did, lock her up, lock him up. We're seeing that today against
I agree with you. I agree with you
yeah.
vehemently on that, and I part with some Republicans in that. I don't think that everything you dislike ought to be punished with the rule of law, but I think that one of the reasons everyone is so spun up and feels so threatened is because a lot of this is opaque. A lot of this is hidden from public view. Lack of transparency makes people agitated. And so on what grounds could you hide your public schedule from public view?
You should never be able to do that. It was Louis Brandeis who said that sunshine is the best disinfectant. And our government should be disclosing everything. Everything is subject to disclosure. Yes. Unless there is an overwhelming national security reason for keeping it temporarily sealed. Nothing should ever be permanently sealed. And I think transparency trumps privacy when you're a government official.
That's right. You don't have to work there. Professor Dershowitz, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A number of new revelations raise profound doubts, unfortunately, about the Robert Mueller investigation. How can we trust the findings? A supporter of Mueller's team is here to explain why you should just be quiet and accept what they tell you. Stay tuned. Special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation has produced its own version of an advent calendar. You don't get chocolates in this one. Every day brings new reason to be skeptical. The investigation is on the level. From Peter Strzok to Lisa Page to Andrew Weissman to Bruce Orr, a number of members of this investigative team appear to be partisan Democrats. Well, they are, because 9 out of 15 of the investigators we know about have given money to the Democrats, to the Clintons. By the way, no matter how partisan you are, have you ever given money to a candidate? Probably not. Only a tiny percentage of Americans do, and it suggests a real commitment to the cause. I have political views. I've never given $1 to a politician. So what does it mean that 9 out of 15 have given money to Democratic politicians? Al Mortura is a lobbyist. He served on Hillary Clinton's finance team in 2016. He joins us now. Al, you've been in Washington for a long time, and you kind of know how it works. You're a partisan Democrat. That's fine. Does it bother you at all that this investigation seems to have a lot of people close to the heart of it who are actively partisan? Doesn't that shake your faith a little bit in this investigation?
Not really. Look, Director Comey, who you talked about in the prior segment, he left. I think both the Democrats and the Republicans thought he should go.
Yeah.
And so if you have problems that need to be rooted out, one of the gentlemen you mentioned, Mr. Strzok, he's been reassigned. I think he works in HR now at the Department of Justice. So
yeah.
I have some faith that they're looking at these things and doing the right by them.
Well, Mueller did the right thing with Strzok. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But why hide? Because Strzok was at the very center of a lot of this stuff. He conducted the Mike Flynn interview, for example. He signed the original investigation order of the Russia-Trump collusion story.
Right.
But why would Mueller hide the fact that he had been demoted for months from Congress? And why won't the FBI answer a very simple question? Is he the one who revised Comey's speech about the Hillary Clinton investigation? Why not? What would be the point of not revealing that?
I mean, actually, I listened to your interview with Senator Johnson. I think all the facts should come out.
Yeah.
What's the problem with that? But I think Mueller runs a very tight ship. You haven't seen many leaks at all. And his view is, I don't know him, but his view is probably, I don't need to share information with these people right now, and I'm not going to.
With the so how? Look, let's be totally honest here. At some point, Democrats are going to take control of a branch of government because
I hope
it's
so.
cyclical. It'll happen. And the FBI is not mostly liberals, actually. The career people, probably mostly pretty conservative. You know, I would argue that. So if you're setting a precedent now that the FBI can kind of do whatever it wants, and if they don't like you, they can crush you, and if they do like you, they let you off, are you comfortable with that standard?
I'm not comfortable with what you just said being the standard. I don't think that's what's actually happening. I think the facts will take us where they take us. And Bob Mueller's a patriot. He's a decorated Marine veteran who received a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. He's a guy who served our country with distinction in Vietnam.
So if you serve your country in Vietnam, I mean, I think Judge Roy Moore served in Vietnam.
He did. I was going further, which is to say he's a staunch Republican. He was appointed by George W. Bush. He was confirmed in a bipartisan way.
I don't care about any of that. I only care about is his behavior, and does it pass a simple fairness test? And I'm starting to wonder.
Look, again, the facts will take us where they take us. What Bob Mueller's trying to do is examine those facts and come to a conclusion. But nobody's going to be criminally prosecuted and proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt because of bias. If those things actually happen with respect to individuals, either in this administration or some of these individuals who have pled, it's going to happen because the facts take us there.
Really? I used to believe that, and then I saw what happened to Cheryl Mills and Huma Abedin, both of whom said, I believe to Peter Strzok in an FBI interview, that they were not aware of Hillary Clinton's private email server. And Cheryl Mills, I think, said she didn't know what an email server was. WikiLeaks released emails in which they discussed the private server. They lied. And they got off. They were not charged. Mike Flynn lied and was charged with a felony and pled to it. So there is selective prosecution, clearly. I mean, that's an example of it. Why wouldn't that make me nervous as an American?
But that happens all the time with prosecutors. I mean, they don't always chase everything down. They don't chase the jaywalker down all the time. I mean, so perhaps what you're saying is exactly right. I don't know all the facts, but that doesn't mean necessarily you shouldn't trust the institution. My concern with respect to that period of time is why did people like Rudy Giuliani and others seem to know that the FBI was about to come out with that second Comey letter? Were there leaks? Because Republicans like to talk about the leaks should be prosecuted.
I don't know.
They should be.
That's an entirely fair question. But you will concede that the FBI has, in a number of specific examples, acted out of political motive in investigations in the last couple of years. Democrats are saying nothing because it's achieving their ends. They're kind of happy with what's going on. It's hamstrung the administration completely. But when they take power at some point, how do you think they'll do against an FBI that has basically unlimited power and no oversight from Congress?
Again, I think that we have to focus on the facts.
Well, those are the facts.
You're suggesting that they're going to take facts, twist them, and enact an agenda that is partisan. I've not seen that. Again, Strzok removed, Comey fired. The current head of the FBI is President Trump's head of the FBI.
Yeah, he is.
The current deputy AG is President Trump's deputy AG, who just testified in Congress.
The president's in charge of the entire.
Who just testified that he believes that that Mueller is totally credible and doing a good job.
Well, I guess we'll see. So let me ask you one final question. So the genesis of all of this was the claim that the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government in order to alter the outcome of the American presidential election. It's a big charge. We've seen no evidence that that's true. If at the end of this investigation you see, I don't know, Paul Manafort and General Flynn go down on perjury charges,
right? But
there's no evidence at all of collusion, would it have been worth it?
Well, we had a president impeached, unfortunately, for perjuring himself, allegedly. So, you know, let's not belittle that.
Well, I am belittling it and saying, and including in the case of Bill Clinton, who should not have been impeached for lying. I'm not defending lying. I'm saying you shut down the federal government. You basically undo the will of the voters in the last election in the service of nothing. I don't know how you could defend that.
That's certainly what I think the Trump supporters believe and are hoping is the case.
No, but do you think that's the case?
I don't know. We don't know yet. We're at the tip of the iceberg.
But why aren't Democrats saying demanding evidence of collusion? Isn't that the whole point?
If Michael Flynn pled to this small charge, as you said, when he faced tens of years of jail time for other charges, there's something going on there. If Papadopoulos, who you didn't mention, promised to be a cooperating witness for months, we don't know what that cooperation will yield. Flynn's promised to be a cooperating witness. We don't know what that will yield. I still think we're at the tip of the iceberg here.
Maybe. And by the way, if there's ever evidence that the Trump campaign or administration colluded with the Russian government to subvert democracy, I'll be the first to denounce them. But I haven't seen in over a year of talking about this every single night a single piece of evidence of that.
And that's
I'm starting to worry.
That's because Bob Mueller's developing a story.
No, it was even before then. We'll see. Al, thank you.
Good to be with you.
The panic over sexual harassment isn't just ending careers. It is now claiming lives. Up next, we'll ask Mark Steyn whether it is time to take a break from all of this, take a breath, and figure out what the rules are going forward. We'll be right back. The wave of sexual harassment allegations over the past couple of months has turned into a maelstrom, which is now ending not just careers, but lives. Yesterday, a Kentucky state representative called Dan Johnson drove to a secluded spot on a rural road, and he shot himself. Johnson posted a suicide note online denying allegations that he'd kissed and groped a 17-year-old girl at a New Year's party 5 years ago. Police investigated that claim at the time and decided not to press charges. But when the allegations surfaced again recently, Johnson again denied them, but apparently believed he had no way out. Was Dan Johnson guilty? We can't say, and now that he's dead, we will likely never know. Meanwhile, yesterday, TV show host Tavis Smiley had his PBS program pulled off the air after claims of misconduct were leveled against him. Smiley responded by denying all the allegations. What's interesting is what Smiley says about the process that ended his career. PBS, he says, launched an investigation into his behavior without even informing him it was going on. Quote, I learned of the investigation when former staffers started contacting me to share the uncomfortable experience of receiving a phone call from a stranger asking whether I had ever done anything to make them uncomfortable and if they could provide other names of persons to call. PBS investigators refused to review any of my personal documentation, refused to provide me the names of any accusers, refused to speak to my current staff, and refused to provide me any semblance of due process to defend myself against allegations from unknown sources. End quote. Now, that's just Smiley's word, of course. We can't confirm any of that. And for what it's worth, Tavis Smiley has never said anything we agree with politically. But that's not the point. The point is that what began as a noble effort to eliminate sexual harassment from American life, an effort we agree with vehemently, is rapidly turning into something dark and menacing. Innocent people fear persecution, and that's always the hallmark of a witch hunt. Others use allegations to settle scores or gain power, and that's the opposite of justice. The rest of the country looks on bewildered and afraid, unsure of what the new rules are, but certain of the punishment for violating them. It is grotesque. Imagine if you were accused by someone whose name you didn't know of a misdeed you couldn't remember or didn't commit. How would you respond to that? You might go on Facebook to protest your innocence, but would that be enough to get your job back? Would it be enough to regain your reputation or the respect of your children? Probably not. What would you do then? Mark Steyn joins us now. Mark, I feel, well, actually so intimidated that I have to say out loud what is obvious, which is I think sexual harassment is abhorrent, obviously, and I think people guilty of it should be punished for it. But I'm starting to be concerned that innocent people are afraid of being hurt, and that's a bad sign. And so the question is, what are the rules? How do we find out what they are? How do you know if you're guilty? What is going on?
Well, realistically, there are no rules. I mean, just to connect it up with the first half of the show, the only serious likelihood of ever getting rid of Bob Mueller and shutting down his investigation, for example, would be if a stenographer said that he'd hugged her inappropriately in 1977. Boom, he'd be gone. He'd be history. He'd be toast. He'd be like these PBS and NPR guys who've had basically 50-year careers vaporized in 24 hours. And what has happened, I think, is what often happens, is the end of any kind of proportion. This started with Harvey Weinstein, who has been credibly accused by actresses on at least 3 continents of rape or brutal sexual assault. And there are names and there are dates and there are places backing up those accusations. As I said, actresses from New Zealand, from France, from the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, all over the map with names. Suddenly, that has morphed into a general accusation by someone you don't know is enough to end your career. Garrison Keillor, for example, I don't care for Garrison Keillor any more than you care for Tavis Smiley. I met him, he was on my BBC show 25 years ago, and he was a cold fish and deeply unpleasant. But I feel about him the way you feel about Tavis Smiley. If he's going to just be vaporized and have his life's work wiped out, at the very least, we should know what he did and who he did it to.
So why is nobody saying that?
Well, I think there's a general agreement on the left, and this has been essentially driven by left-wing dominated industries, that they're now weaponizing sex the way they've weaponized race. That it's a useful, that they've concluded it's a useful weapon to them, and that necessarily means a kind of clearing out the decks. I mean, I'm astonished, you know, on the vast empty plains of the PBS and NPR schedules, you can actually hunt buffalo there. All the septuagenarian hosts have been gone, just gone in moments. And it's absolutely astonishing to me. And it will, in the end, make social relations impossible. You must think, as I think occasionally, do I really want to be alone with a female employee now? I
think that all the time.
Who knows how she's going to feel about it in 30 years' time? I mean, I don't think that's necessarily in the interests of women in the workplace. I don't think it's in the interests of social relations. It's an insane moral panic that started with genuine rape, genuine violence, genuine power issues, and now just seems to have degenerated into one anonymous accusation can end a career.
So I wonder why, I mean, again, I think it's always valuable and virtuous to make sure the guilty are punished. That's what justice is. But I also think that journalists play a role in this, and that they ought to be the responsible parties in these stories. And maybe somebody should pull back a little bit and make certain that the allegations are true and that the process is transparent before destroying people's careers and reputations. But they're not doing that.
Well, I think one reason they're not doing that is because essentially it's their business that is being clobbered. Basically, TV and motion pictures are two of the most desirable businesses to be in. There are far more attractive women wanting to work in those industries than in any other industries on the planet. I live in far northern New Hampshire, and the local feed store does not have a casting couch, because if you said to a comely young lady, you know, there could be a really good job as night clerk here if you play your cards right, she'd laugh in your face and go off and do something else. But there's no, but in television and in motion pictures, there is the supply far outpaces demand.
No, that's absolutely true. No, it is a perfect environment for misdeeds like this. It's just that not everyone accused is guilty. Mark Steyn, thank you for your wisdom as always.
Thanks a lot, Tucker.
The college president says the sexual harassment wave shouldn't surprise anybody because we spent decades literally training children to behave this way. That college president joins us next. A lot of people were caught completely off guard by how sexual harassment took over the news this fall. But to Everett Piper, who's the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, All of this was, quote, as predictable as the sunrise. In a recent piece, Piper says, quote, all we need to do is look at our public schools and what we've been teaching for the past several decades. For years, our schools have mocked morality. Why are we now shocked to find that we live in a society there's no understanding of personal morality? Everett Piper is also the author of the book, Not a Daycare, The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. He joins us tonight. Mr. Piper, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Tucker.
So flesh out what you mean by that. You were not surprised because why?
Well, I believe that ideas have consequences. I'm an educator. I believe that what's taught today in our classrooms will probably be practiced tomorrow in our culture. And when we teach sexual license rather than sexual morality, when we teach that sex is recreational rather than moral, we shouldn't be surprised to find a culture of men that behave licentiously. This is predictable. When we teach that sex is something that you can experiment with rather than something that you should be morally responsible for, I think you can see what you're going to have in culture as a result of that.
I agree with that, of course. I mean, I think you're obviously right. But it's a little more complicated than that, in that the people who are pushing licentiousness are also sort of pushing a kind of puritanical view of sex. Expressions of sexual desire are both encouraged, but they're also penalized by the same people, if you see what I mean. And so I find it confusing that way.
Well, I'm not too sure what you mean with regard to those people that are pushing licentiousness are also being puritanical. What I see in our public schools, for example, and when I say public schools, I don't mean any local district or any particular teacher. What I mean is our national educational system is known for doing what Jay, Oklahoma does, and Edmond, Oklahoma, and Cherry Creek, and Fox Ridge, Colorado, and Yale and other institutions in the Ivy League, and then those institutions and universities on the West Coast such as UCLA and Berkeley. All of these institutions have been celebrating sexual license for decades. In other words, they've been giving instruction manuals, literal instruction manuals, on how to engage in sexual activities with the hope and the prayer that a thin layer of latex will keep our kids from getting a disease. Now, when there is no moral boundary left in that educational discussion other than consent, if you can merely find somebody that will consent to your libidinous appetite, then what was wrong 5 minutes ago all of a sudden becomes okay because you found a willing accomplice. When that is the discussion that it revolves around the sexual appetite of our culture, then we're going to have a predictable consequence that you see on the nightly news, and that's why I'm talking to you.
So what would you teach if you wanted to prevent what we're seeing now?
Well, I think you teach that sex is a moral decision and not something that floats with culture. I don't think that you... Let's get to the issue of morality being judged by consent. Consent puts all responsibility onto the other person, and it puts no responsibility on you. And like I just said, what was wrong 5 minutes ago all of a sudden becomes right if I can just find a willing accomplice. Hopefully, we all recognize that morality has a more objective definition and standard than merely dumbing it down to the consent of another party. So do we agree that sex is a moral discussion, or is it just a recreational discussion? If we all agree that it's moral, and I would argue that culture is showing its cards right now and agreeing that it does, great, we all agree. Now, where does that moral standard come from, and can we discuss it as being an objective standard rather than a postmodern construct?
Interesting. Mr. Piper, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Well, Trump apprentice Omarosa Manigault just left the White House in noisy fashion. At least one report says she was kicking and screaming. She denies that. We will seek the truth in this case next with the great Greg Gutfeld. Stay tuned.
Omarosa has to go. You're fired.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Omarosa has a huge chip on her shoulder. She felt that she was superior to the other people.
Former Trump apprentice Omarosa Manigault just left her job at the White House, doing whatever it is she did there. Now, wild stories are coming out in the wake of her departure. Left-wing radio reporter April Ryan, not the most reliable source, but she says Omarosa got the news from Chief of Staff John Kelly and immediately had a meltdown worthy of reality television, lots of shouting, angry profanity. Today, though, Omarosa appeared on GMA and denied being fired at all.
I resigned, and I didn't do that in the residence as being reported. John Kelly and I sat down in the Situation Room, which is a very secure, very quiet room in the White House, and we had a very candid conversation. And I wanted to make the 1-year mark. That was one of the goals that I set out to, and then get back to my life.
So you resigned. You weren't fired as it reported.
And you know, I like to hear all of these interesting tales, but I have to tell you that they're 100% false. And one of the things that I'd ask of those people who are making those assertions, since they assert that I did it so publicly, is where are the pictures or videos? If I had confronted John Kelly, who is a very formidable person, it would garner enough attention for anyone in the room to at least take a picture or a video or something.
So you're saying that all these reports are coming from one person, but you
one person? No, let's be clear. Only one person.
Only one person.
No one else has reported what she's reporting, and this is the one person who has attacked me for the last year. And so you know that this is personal. I was very respectful of the process. Certainly, I had more access than most, and people had problems with that. People had problems with my 14-year relationship with this president, but I've always been loyal to him, straightforward, and I've provided him with the support that he's needed throughout this year in the White House.
And you say you resigned. So when you resigned, the reports that you were escorted off the grounds. Were you escorted off?
No, I was not. And in fact, Secret Service put out a statement because I think that they were bothered with the assertion that they were involved with any type of escorting or shutting me down, that sort of thing. And I think you should take the word of the U.S. Secret Service.
April Ryan, though, is standing by her claims.
When Sarah finally gave me the information about the negotiated resignation, that there's said to be a signature people have seen, that with the end date of January 20th, I said, what about the other stuff? What about the drama that I'm hearing about the firing? Everyone went dark. But I'm continuing to hear information from all sides, I mean, credible sources. And I'm not the only one. I may have broken the story, but CBS, ABC, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, I'm not the only one. I have no vendetta. I am a reporter who's covering the beat.
So you can see here in D.C., we're still engaged on important work to improve the life of every American. Greg Gutfeld co-hosts The Five here on Fox, and he joins us. So, Greg, Omarosa got fired from what exactly?
That's a good question. She's one of those types of people that who gets a job as a favor out of loyalty, and no one's quite sure what she does. This happens at Fox News a lot. The initials of our Omarosa is Ed Henry. But what do you expect? What do you expect from the most unpopular reality star since the naked guy on Survivor, who I think is actually going to replace her? She was awful coming in. We knew that. And the fact that her main goal was to last 1 year. 1 year on the job. That's I wouldn't call that ambitious. By the way, if you read how this whole conversation went, I guess they said that John Kelly and her had a candid conversation, and candid is basically public relations for, I don't like you, you're a bad person, please get the hell out of here. Then they said they went to the White House, and the White House said something like, we wish her the best, which means we hope she finds something else to do and leaves us alone because she scares the crap out of us.
Well, and maybe they have reason to be afraid. This morning on one of the morning shows, she said, I have a lot to tell you about what the White House was like, and I will be telling my story. I mean, that's a direct pitch to publishers, isn't it?
It is. This is all about a book. She says she had problems with the White House in terms of her helping her own community, and I'm trying to figure out, what is that community? Is that community consisting of unbearable, self-centered reality stars? Because then there are only two members, her and Piers Morgan. So that's going to sell two books.
Piers Morgan, I can't control myself. He's smart.
I just like ribbing Piers because he deserves it. Ever since he posed in that centerfold, I can't take him seriously.
I don't get those magazines at home, so I have
7 copies. I have 7 copies. I'd love to interoffice you, the one that I have shellacked.
So how do you manage, if you're running the White House, how do you manage a former employee like Omarosa?
You know, you put her in a job where she can't break anything. And what happened was she can, if there's a vase in that room, she's going to break it, because it's all about her. She lorded her relationship with Donald Trump over everybody else. That's why she brought that wedding, the 40-member wedding group to the White House. I wouldn't even do that to my house, mainly because I don't like people. But it's just that you don't make good decisions based on loyalty. Donald Trump overlooked her competence because he felt he owed her something. And loyalty, Tucker, is overrated. I would turn on you in a second. I owe you nothing.
I couldn't disagree with you, Margaret.
Yes. I would drop you so quickly.
She did add levity.
She did. No, this is the most interesting White House in the history of history.
Yes.